Well, hello, and welcome to the Oral History Criminology Project. We're here today in Baltimore, Maryland at the 2019 Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences meetings. My name is Gregory, and I'm here with Dr. Myren Schwartz. I'm really pleased to interview an award-winning teacher, mentor, prolific author, and researcher. Marty has won the 2019 Outstanding Mentor Award, the 2018 Outstanding Teacher Award. He's been a visiting research fellow at the National Institute of Justice and at the University of Melbourne in Australia. He's been an Academy Fellow of the Criminal Justice Sciences in 2008 and a Presidential Research Scholar in Social and Behavior Sciences at Ohio University. He's won many more awards, including the Distinguished Scholar Award within several divisions, including Critical Criminology in the Division of Women in Crime. And in addition to that, his recent book has won the Book of the Year Award, the book Abusive Endings out of Victimology. So I had to say all that because I know Marty doesn't want to brag. But so Marty, let's start at the beginning. I know you're a New Yorker, and can you tell me a little bit about growing up in New York?
Well, I'm not New York City. I'm from Westchester County, and it was small town atmosphere. So I don't know what I could tell you about growing up in New York. It was like small town America everywhere.
Okay.
It was very urban in a lot of ways, but since we weren't allowed to leave town, it became a small town because we lived within the borders. We weren't allowed, once I got my driver's license, I lived on the Connecticut border, and we couldn't drive in Connecticut before the age of 18, and I couldn't drive in New York City before the age of 18, so I was stuck in Portchester, New York, and that was it. But,
okay. And then what got you to your undergraduate degree at the University at Albany?
Albany was changing quite a bit in those days. In fact, there was a famous sweatshirt that they had, which was, it started at the bottom, or at the top it said, State University of New York Teachers College, that's crossed out, State University of New York College of Education, crossed out, and all these different names that it had. And I was part of the group the first year that they began bringing in, and I never figured out how they did it. It was nothing that ever came to my attention, but suddenly a group of downstaters started coming. Rather than the tradition, it was a university of blonde kids with a piece of alfalfa in their mouth. And I was in the first group of kids from downstate starting to come. And then it flooded. Then it became almost a New York City school within 20 years.
And your degree was in sociology?
My undergraduate degree was in sociology. It was, I claimed at the time, I came in as a, this will show you something. I came in as a business major because my father wanted me to go into business. And I decided I took an accounting course. And it's hard to imagine anything more boring than adding up total columns of figures by hand, which is what that was accounting in the 1960s. And I said to the dean, I want to change a major. And he said, oh, well, to what? And I said, well, I'm taking Intro to Soc. It's fabulous. And he said, well, that's arts and sciences. I don't know if your grades are good enough to get it, because business is where we put the jerks and the dopes in this place. I'm not sure you're good enough to be in sociology and the arts and sciences. They looked and said, oh, okay, you're okay. You can come in. Things have changed a little bit over the years.
So after you graduated, I know that you were a journalist for a while. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I can. I was going to tell you that I view a lot of my life. I think my life and many, many other people, my whole family and lots of other people, that my life is more serendipity than anything else. How do we end up in these places? Did I, plan this for many years? No. I became a journalist in college. I can't even remember why. I think I decided to do a humor column because I was a jerk. And then I started going out with this young lady who was the editor. And I became very involved in the newspaper for reasons that had nothing to do with newspapering. And when I graduated, I decided hey, newspapering is what I can do. I went down to the Albany Times-Union and applied for a job. And got it, is what it boils down to. So I worked at the Albany Times-Union, the Hearst Corporation, for a number of years. It was great. It taught me a lot of things, like how to live on an extraordinary small amount of money. And I got, by the way, $81 a week.
Oh, wow.
That was my salary, out of which I bought a car and got married and got an apartment. All out of that 81. She didn't work those days. She was a student. So I learned a lot. It taught me things like that really helped this career. It's a good part of this career, which is you will type fast and you will do the work. And you can get beaten up for doing things like writing out your story first in longhand. That was a problem. What they had ended up doing was they just kept saying, I'd go to a press conference at 3:30, 4 o'clock, come back at 6 o'clock, and my story was due at 7. And I didn't mean 7:15. I had to get 10 paragraphs in and hand it in, whatever it was. And that had a lot to do with why I published a lot. I don't come to conclusions any faster than anyone else. I actually probably read a little bit slower than a lot of people. But once I decide to write, once my head's together and I'm ready to write, I knock it out. I write at the speed that I can type. And that's been a very good training. Journalism is excellent training.
Well, most certainly it was.
Also learned grammar and lots of other weird tricks.
Well, it served you well. I think you have something like over 75 articles, 16 books, and at least another 75 essays and book chapters. So
Right.
definitely starting out as a writer served you well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It did.
Tell me about leaving journalism and going into graduate school.
Actually, that's interesting. I think one of the questions they were in this group of videos they like is, how did you find out and enter, what brought you into criminology? I'll phrase it that way. And it's actually an amusing story. As I said, almost everything in my life and a lot of people's lives near me has been based on serendipity. And that was another example. I came home from work one day. I knew there were things I wanted to do. I wanted to go to Europe. I wanted to, I was getting more and more interested in going back to school more. So I started getting a master's degree in political science. And that was totally based on a misperception that everyone who was a reporter in the London bureau of the Herald Tribune or the New York Times was a specialist in international relations, which is not true, but it sounded right. So I got a master's degree, not in international relations, but in political science. About the time I'm finishing that, I'm seriously thinking of going to school, and I come home from work one day, and the guy upstairs, it was a two-family house, was out on the front lawn with a little tiny hibachi cooking a steak. And I'm looking going, what is going on here? You're poor. You can't afford steaks. Why are you doing it? Oh, he says, there's this really wonderful thing. There's this brand new school that just opened up in Albany called Criminal Justice. And they have a lot of money. You should really look into this. And he said, I said, who do I look into it with? He says, no, the dean is Richard A. Myren, Dick Myren. You should talk to him. I said, Dick Myren? He's running for school board in Voorheesville, New York. And the election's tomorrow. And I'm covering it. I could talk to him. I go out there. I stand in a hallway. It took him 3 hours to count the votes. At the end of the 3 hours, he lost, I won. I had a fellowship to go back to school.
That's great.
And whatever that thing was, criminal justice or something. So, I mean, it wasn't like I had never heard of the subject matter. I was a police reporter for a number of years, and I'd covered a lot of things for the Albany Times-Union. But as an academic, I had no knowledge of it at all, no desire until I found out there was money.
And then what did you think once you started your coursework?
Oh, I fell in love with it. It was wonderful. It was the best field you get into. I like the idea that I've always been someone who's been in a lot of different fields, rather than sort of broad but shallow rather than deep. And it's one of the advantages of criminal justice, is where a field that covers, you can go into. I didn't, but you could go into psychotherapy. You could get off and go into all sorts of macroeconomics. There are all kinds of places you can go without leaving the field.
Right.
And that was one of the things I really liked about it.
Yeah. Well, you must have liked even more about it because you decided to get a PhD. And your PhD is from the University of Kentucky.
Right.
What made you think to pursue the PhD?
I want to stay in academics.
Because?
It's a union card.
That's not why. Why did you really want to get your PhD?
I needed it to stay in the job.
No,
If I wanted to be a professor of anything, I needed to get a PhD.
Well, I happen to know that it's because you love teaching.
Well, teaching was a great occupation.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. I had taught for a while at the University of Cincinnati at that point, and I wanted to stay in the field.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. It was a great life. It actually was, it's the opposite of what I thought. I mean, my attitude always was, my father was a workaholic, and I said, I'll never do that in my life. You're never going to catch me 9 to 5ing it or whatever. And the joy of academics is you set your own hours. And I never really understood that you set your own hours means that you get to work all weekend.
Right. That's so true.
I worked more than my father ever thought of working, which you don't get to that many books and articles by skipping the part that does do your research.
That's so true. Well, a lot of us get through our master's and our PhD programs with a lot of help from other people, a lot of mentoring and things like that. Did you feel like you had any strong mentors along the way?
I had a number of mentors along the way, but in some way I never had what most people mean. Most people mean by mentoring means you hang around one person and they are in charge and they help you out and they get you your first job and they do things like that. And things are a little different with me. No, most of my mentors, most of the people I learned an enormous amount from, with 2 or 3 exceptions, were my peers. And there were mentors that were tremendously important to me. For example, when I taught at University of Cincinnati, Keith Haley was the chair. And Keith was a wonderful person, possibly the most dedicated teacher I'd ever known in my life. And he had all these, he was also very big on being a former cop and a former Marine and everything else, and was very big on there are rules for everything. But his rules were things like you will show up to class as a teacher, and you will be super prepared, and you will do a great job, and there's just no excuse for missing anything. And he really did install for me a number of these things in the beginning, from the very earliest days teaching. So he was very important to me. I was thinking before, I don't normally think like this, but I was trying to think about who's been important to me, who have I met as I run through life. And one of the advantages of, I don't know how to put it, I was never impressed by celebrities. I was never going out looking for the top person. And that started I think part of that was being a journalist, in that I met a lot of my childhood heroes. I met a lot of people who were very big name at the time. I mention them today, it won't mean anything to you, but they were big at the time. Well, like, for example, if you were an anti-war activist in the 1960s, you would be very impressed by Wayne Morse, who was the dean of the University of Oregon Law School, who became a U.S. Senator and was one of only 2 people who vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, one of the most important resolutions that were ever passed by the Senate, which gave Lyndon Johnson the power to wage the Vietnam War. And that was just really impressive. And I actually, there's a good example, because I got to meet him, and the more I met him, the more I realized that idols never are what you ideate. They're not what you think they are. And he was a good example. He was not that great to me. I always had the impression he voted against it because he didn't think that Vietnamese people were worth it. You know, he came across to me as a bit of a racist. So and that was true of a lot of things. A lot of the teachers that I really thought were brilliant, and they did great work, and that's fine. But when I got to go to parties and things like that, I also found there were misogynists, dirty, drunks, and a lot of other things. Said, I can do that with my friends. I don't need to have top professors that I can do this with. So the argument, I answer to that is the long-winded, I'm always long-winded, way of telling you that I never went out chasing after mentors, never went after chasing big-name people. The people who influenced me the most tended to be always either people my age or younger. People like you, in a lot of ways, were very influential in a lot of things that I learned, in the way I learned criminology. I mean, obviously, the most important mentor in some ways in my life was Walter DeKeseredy, who I ran into as a graduate student, and he asked me to hire him at Cincinnati, or excuse me, at Ohio University, and I told him that I was chair of the search committee then, and I told him no, that we were looking for a woman that year, and that was. He announced that he was not interested in the sex change operation. So we got to talking, and it lasted 30 years. We have since put out, I don't know exactly, 8 books, something like that together. And last I counted, 35 articles. So including one this morning we sent out. He's been an important influence, but a lot of people, there's a whole group, large groups of people, some of whom I guess could be considered mentors. They were senior to me in rank for a while. Jock Young, Elliot Curry at Irvine, several people like that. But I tended to see them not so much as mentors, but as colleagues.
Well, on the flip side of that, you're an Outstanding Mentor Award recipient, and I know so many colleagues and scholars in our field who count you as their mentor. So what is your thoughts on how you work with that next generation and now how you support them into their careers?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've never understood a lot of my peers on that subject, on why they're not better at it. In that my attitude has generally been, I guess, in running across my career, one of the things that doing this has forced me to do is something I never do. Is for someone who is an egomaniac like me, it's hard to imagine that I'm one of these people. I don't spend time thinking about my career, what was important to me, who I liked best, and these type of things. But the times that I was happiest, I think, of my entire career came when I was in a more liberal arts atmosphere and it worked on my rear end off, but had large numbers of students, a lot of advisees. And like when I was at Ohio University, one of the things that was really good from my point of view, that gave me the most joy, was I did get known on campus, and I knew people on campus. I knew people every nook and corner of campus. I knew a registrar, I knew people in student housing, I knew people across campus. And one of the things that it enabled me to do was solve problems. That if people had problems, I could go to the registrar and intervene. I could go to housing and intervene. And I got a lot of joy from that. I mean, that was what I was in the business for, was teaching on one hand, helping people on the other. And the same applies to all kinds of mentors and a lot of different mentees in different roles. I never understood why it's just so easy to help other people out. And so I usually go out of my way. It's if I get a notice on my desk that says, we got $500, got any ideas of who we can give it to? Here's the criteria. I mean, I'll actually take a minute and figure out if there's anyone in the world that I know who could use this and fits the criteria, and I'll ship it to them. And as a result of which, my students have won a heck of a lot of paper awards, which comes more from just being there and sending it in. And a lot of other things. You're right, I have a lot of students that aren't even my students. People I've run into that that I've been able to help in that way. I think that I get more joy out of that. It's just what help, it's almost selfish in some ways. I like working with other people. I like being the solution to a problem, helping people out with problems. And that's why I'm able to do mentoring. Does that answer any of that?
It does. And in going through your scholarly record as I prepared for this, a huge percentage of your journal articles are co-authored with your former students.
At some point, current students.
And current students, and some junior faculty as well. You're not just limited to students, you're also supporting junior faculty.
The problem is these students keep aging. And then they get jobs.
Part of the interview. So tell me a little bit about working with students and with junior faculty towards publication.
Well, in some cases, it's, again, this can be taken as a tip to people. One of the things is if you have the better students, and of course, part of that, it works. When I say I have very good students, a lot of that is my own attitude. And then I've heard a lot of people in the same department will trash their students, say, I couldn't work with her. She's a student. And what does she know? And usually, by the way, those are the people who claim to be the most student-oriented,
Right.
are the ones who act like that.
True.
But then what they did was, the students I've worked with, also, that's one of the reasons I have a lot of articles, is working with students. I mean, there's only a certain amount of work you can do yourself. I mean, there are people in this organization, if you look at whatever, Messner, Stephen Messner, and I don't want to start names, but 10 or 15 major names in this field who can put out 150 articles, but I don't know any human who can. What happened is a lot of these people brought things to the table that helped me do it. When I was at Ohio University, they had something called Honors Tutorial College, and I used to love that. That was great. Honors Tutorial College had a system whereby students did a senior thesis, and it was a big deal. It was pretty much all they did their senior year in their major was work on a thesis. And I used to take one a year and work with them long and deep and develop a major data set. That was what I was teaching them at that point, was a quantitative, how to develop the data set, the questionnaire, IRB, everything we did, and develop this huge data set. And then they would dip into it and write it up for their thesis, usually 15 minutes before graduation, and get out. And they would leave me the data set. And then I was able to work with it and end up publishing out of it, co-authored articles. And that accounted, I don't know what it is, 10, 11, 12 articles in my life, which is really as much as most people publish.
Yeah.
And those are all started out as honors theses. And I mean, you have to really you have to train people well and get them to do good work. But then they just handed me on a silver platter. So that accounted for a certain amount of it. And the other one is I don't like working alone as much. So working with students is also another way of, it's a social phenomenon. It may not be work, it may be fun. And And it's also a form of helping out that in 5 or 6 cases, it was pretty planned right out that somebody needed an article in a hurry because they're going up for in the job market or
Sure.
going up for tenure or something on that line.
Well, while we're on the topic of articles, can you talk a little bit about your first article?
I probably could. If I made sure I get it right. The first published article I ever did also answers a second question, which is, how did I get into my subfield, which is violence against women? And the answer was, I was sitting in Albany, chatting with Todd Clear at one point, who's now at Rutgers. And Todd and I were discussing the problem. Both of us, were connected to women who were, we weren't connected, we're married to women who were very much involved in the feminist movement, in second wave feminism. And we were thus quite involved. And one of the things that happened, we began discussing the idea of rape law. And it was what we identified at that point in the mid-1970s as one of the great places where the law was specifically unequal, where the law very specifically was prejudiced against women, by name, purposefully. And we ended up doing several articles, and that the first one appeared in the Bulletin of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law. And that was the first article we ever did in 1978. And the second one was in Crime and Delinquency, and that was called Toward a New Law on Rape. The first one identified the problems, and the second one, we tried to develop a law and talk about what needed to be changed in a new rape law, which was actually pretty predictive in that's exactly, a lot of what we recommended was adopted over the next 10 years by most states. That was how that led to a few more articles and in the field, as we just kept finding that the whole field of violence against women is broad and deep. There's just so much to cover. No one can be an expert in the whole field. It covers child sexual abuse, adult sexual abuse, sexual abuse against men and women, violence against men, violence against women, harassment, sexual harassment. It covers stalking. It's just an enormous number of subtopics in an enormous number of ways. When you start in the psychology of it, sociological problems, criminological and legal, and you cover this enormous array of data to the point where there must be, who knows anymore, 500 articles a month. No one can keep up with it. But we try.
So, thinking about this body of work that you've contributed to, what would you say was your most, the contribution you're most proud of?
Well, I don't know if it's most proud of, but the main contribution I think we could say that we made was that Walter and I developed something called male peer support theory. And we started talking about it. It was his doctoral dissertation. But I'm not talking behind his back. He'll be glad to explain it to you in these words. It was pretty simplistic at that point. And what I did for him is when we got together around 1990 to discuss this in detail, I brought in sociology. He was a social psychologist and was very mechanistic in his thinking. And we brought in a lot of the social forces that affect the development of male peer support. And it's moved from there. We've done, as I said, on male peer support alone, I don't know for sure, but around 35 articles. Last time I counted was 30. But we've done 3 this year alone. So I'm sure we're up to about 36 or 37 articles on it, and several books, including one that we did for Northeastern University Press a few years ago that was a summary of 25 years of data, of analysis of male peer support theory. So that's what I view as my theory and, and my major contribution so far.
And where are you at currently in terms of publications? Where's your focus now?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's something I've thought about, and it may come up. Maybe I'll do it right now. One of the questions that comes up here is, what's your recommendation to other people? And I recommend thinking about it. I haven't done it. I did a very poor job of it, in fact. But the question would be, how specialized should you be? People in other fields, I don't know, maybe I'm being ignorant, but my impression has been that people like in botany will burrow deeper and deeper and deeper in one subject, and you'll finally end up in some subfield. You're the world's greatest authority in the underleaf of Venezuelan ficus plants. But that's all you know. But you are the one authority in the entire world on that subject. We never done that. Walter and I both have gotten into 15 different fields, and we keep adding more. Rural sociology, rural criminology has been very big in the last 5 years for us. But even earlier, we did a book on it, so that's what started us in the field. It's an interesting question of which way is better. In a lot of ways, I can see the advantages of staying narrow, being the greatest authority on male rape or something, a subject that you have now done 50 to 75 articles in male rape, and you are widely known in that area. In our case, we would more likely to do what we do and then get excited by something else new. I mean, I have written in, I have it written down. I won't remember unless I look it up, but it's the number of areas that I've written in are pretty amazing to me. Corrections is where I started. Policing, certainly any of the violence against women, a whole broad range. We've covered articles on almost everything in the field. And courts, we've done articles on the field on probation. Almost everything that we could come up with that interested us, or me, ended up writing on at some point or another. Drug laws. And I find it made me a better rounded, much more interesting and much more interested person. Well, I don't think it did as well for international reputation. I think the reputation might have been better if I was the underside of the ficus leaf. But I'm much more impressed myself. I just has been better. And it makes me a better teacher. It makes me, and then I can go into a broader course like Intro to Criminal Justice. And while I don't like teaching war stories when it's all you got, I found that students really do like a story here and there, something that can illuminate the point and make it sound like the teacher actually knew what he was talking about. And I'm much more likely to have that for each section of the field, whether we're talking about plea bargaining or whether we're talking about how the Supreme Court operates. I have stories from my life that I can bring in. And that's mostly because we've published in so many different fields. But that wasn't your question, was it? You were asking me, what am I doing now? What am I doing now? Well, sometimes you end up more than anything else being driven by data. When you find yourself a nice data set. So we had that. We had the Canadian National Survey of Sexual and Physical Violence that Walter and I put out I don't remember, 3 books and maybe 15 articles on. That kept me in a business for a while. Right this minute, we're doing more work on, Walter got the contract from West Virginia University to do the campus climate survey and added a large number of pieces of material to it on a lot of questions that people don't ask in campus climate surveys on things like stalking, sexual harassment, and a few other areas. And we have been doing a lot of work out of that, a large number of articles out of that database. The last 3 have been on LGBTQ communities and how they respond and how they are victimized in these on college campuses, which doesn't make me an LGBTQ expert at all, but it does show you I have some interest in that area.
What would you say are your identifying characteristics across your work?
Identifying characters across my work. Well, one I can tell you that I'm proud of. I don't know what else would be identifying. The one I can tell you that I'm most proud of is that we write in English. And that's sort of a joke about it, but it means plain, simple. We write in high school English. And which means a number of things. It means that people can follow it, people can understand it. Occasionally teachers hate it because it isn't obscure enough. I've gotten that review literally in those words. But particularly book reviews to publishers of it's too accessible. But the other side is when we do a lot of these monographs on things, on domestic violence, on rape, one of the things we found is the books end up very often in the hands of survivors and victims who I get much more joy out of it, getting a letter back about how much they read the book and enjoyed it and understood all of it than I would out of being able to produce, if I was Jacques Lacan and produced something that I never figured out that nobody can read. Even if you read French, you can't read it. I don't understand that. The advantage of talking like a sociologist, which is altogether endemic in the field.
Sure.
We don't. I think that's what I'm proud of more than anything else.
I did want to ask you about when you were teaching for the military. I know that's bouncing around a little bit. It's not,
Yeah, it sure is.
Following a nice order, but that was one of the things that I thought was so interesting that I wanted to ask you about.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, well, tell me about that time when you were teaching for the military. How did you get into doing that, and why were you doing that?
I didn't have a job. I was in, I told you that one of the main things I wanted to do in my life when I was a kid was go to Europe for a while. And I ended up going. And I was in London and I was working on some projects. I worked in New Scotland Yard for a while. And what happened basically was I found out that University of Maryland had a European division. And they taught in London. And it was just plain old American courses to plain old Americans. And you might appreciate, since you work with the military, the first job I ever had, you got a temporary clearance to, while you waited for your security clearance to go through, you could teach one course. That was their deal, because it took so long for them to run it through. The first course the course that they assigned me to was in Cheltenham Spa on a base that does not exist. It was a CIA secret base. In fact, if you wanted to call them, you had to call the London Embassy, where you were patched through, because nobody could know where this base was. And that was the military's idea of one course I could teach while waiting my security clearance.
Wow.
We taught it on Friday night for 4 hours and Saturday morning for 4 hours, once a week, and maybe 3 hours. And I had to spend the night in Cheltenham. And they put us in we couldn't get deep into the base. And so we had to be in an outlying building on the outer perimeter. And they found us seats in a basement, in the boiler room, which they turned off over the weekend. So we were sitting there. It was a pretty good Friday night. Saturday morning we were freezing. It dropped to 45 degrees. That was the military. But then I taught on a number of bases. I tell people I was probably on more military bases than anyone who's in the military was on. Because to deal at the University of Maryland in those days, I'm sure it's still true today, is they owned the Bachelor of Arts degree in liberal arts in Europe. And in those days, the U.S. was all over the place. They taught on 100 and something bases. And when you signed a contract, you taught an 8-week term, 2 courses in 8 weeks. So it's equivalent to teaching 4 courses in a semester. And they shipped you wherever they wanted to. And although there are a tremendous number of bases in Germany, I hadn't quite forgiven them for World War II yet, and killing a lot of my relatives. So I tried to stay out of Germany as much as I could. So I spent a lot of time. They accommodated me up to a point. And I spent a lot of time in Spain and Italy. I spent some time in Belgium at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Personnel Europe base. That was nice. And then all over Germany also. So what you did is they couldn't move. They were military. So what they did is they sipped in, depending on how big the base was, 1 or 2 professors in 8 weeks. And they taught 2 biology courses or 2 English courses, or English they never taught because there are too many Americans abroad with PhDs. And you just, it was an intriguing experience. It taught you a lot about operating in minimal conditions. And I taught 1 course in Spain I don't remember the month it was, whether it was summer. It didn't make any sense it was summer. It was hot, really hot. But we taught the course in a pilot's briefing room up above the biggest airplane hangar on base. And it was so hot up there that the graphite in the pencils was melting. Wow. And they're warming up jets underneath us.
Wow.
And we're up there trying to teach. I taught 2 or 3 times in an elementary school classroom that they had on base, which was nice. I got all these 6'5" guys in these little tiny chairs. That was a joy. And I taught once. They didn't have any room whatsoever for us, but the course had met, so we had to teach it. So we taught it sprawled on mats in the gym.
Wow.
And almost everything else that you can think of. So you learn a lot about making do. You can't worry about the fact that you don't have any chalk, or there's no library, and there's all kinds. I had an MGB, and I'm traveling with 2 cartons of books. And they'd say, well, I don't have anything I could write my term paper on. I said, well, then stop by, because I've got some books for you. and give them books.
You mentioned serendipity, and it's kind of the idea you're in the right place at the right time, where things just fall into place. But as I'm listening to you, I really feel like you're the kind of person that takes opportunities, that has an idea and follows through with it, that looks at what's happening around you and how to best take advantage of that for yourself and for others. And
well, let me stick to that for a second. Then you can ask the other half of your question. Yes, and I had some, there's some stories about my life in serendipity, and it is serendipitous, a lot of this. But you're right. For example, one of them was how did I get the job I got at the University of Cincinnati? The way I got that, I had been at Albany with the thing I just mentioned, Dick Myren, who got me in there. Now it's years later, and I was at the University Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences meetings. You may have heard of them. In 1978 in New Orleans. And I'm looking for a job. I'm wandering around. I go over and I see Dick Myren is talking to some guy, and I just stopped and said hello. Same thing, it's just hallway stuff going on. And Dick says, Bob, talking to Bob Mills of the University of Cincinnati, you got a job opening, don't you, Bob? Mm-hmm. So why don't you should look at this guy. He's good. Bob says, I'm tired of this stuff. He goes, all right, I'll tell you what. I'm getting up at dawn tomorrow, and I'm going to go over to the Café du Monde, have some beignet and some coffees. And if you can be there at 7 a.m., I'll talk to you. And walks away. Leaves me there. I said, hey, lead is a lead. 7 a.m., I'm out there. I ended up getting an interview. That was the weirdest interview I'd ever had. And I ended up getting the job. And it was interesting because I looked at it and I said, wonder why I never applied for that job. And a year later, I was then named as the punishment detail. The last person hired had to chair the search committee for the next year. And I would go into files. I'm looking for the ad. I find the ad, and it says, do not apply unless you have at least 3 years experience as a police officer or in corrections. And I said, I don't have any of that. Why did you hire me? Bob? Bob goes, we asked that? Which teaches you a little bit about the way we run academic searches. But you're right. I mean, it fits in. Yes, I think it's a total serendipitous thing. I'm wandering in the streets, and the ideal job for me that ended up making my whole life so much better is unbelievable. I met my wife at Cincinnati. Things were really good for me, and it was great. I met it because Dick turned to Bob and said, hey, why don't you hire this guy? Total serendipity. But on the other hand, the whole argument that you're looking at, which is, yeah, it means I had to show up at 7 a.m. I had to do a great job at the interview. I had to deal with the lunatic interview they set me up for, which I'll tell you in a second. It's a good story. And then I had to do, well in the job. So, yes, it's you have to seize opportunity. But my whole family has been like that. Everything in my family, in fact, that department was wonderful because everyone in there was there by accident. None of us planned for a career in criminology. Candace McCoy was our superstar lawyer who was just plain unemployed. And so I was looking for a job as a legal secretary and was reading the newspaper and saw an ad, a want ad, in Cincinnati. They made them take out want ads in the local paper. For any academic job. For provost.
Wow.
Someone in human benefits had this bright idea. And she sees the ad and says, hey, I can do that. I've been a lawyer, I can teach. And everyone in the department was like that. It was a fun department from that point of view in those days. Oh, I was going to say the interview. I want to tell you that real fast. Here's my real tip. Show up when you travel for a job interview, show up dressed well. I got picked up at the airport by the department secretary, interestingly, who's taking me in, and I said, where are we going next? And she said, we're going down to such and such a building because you're going to do your talk now. I said, what? My talk is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. She said, oh, no, they changed it. You're talking now. We're going to Keith Haley's class. You're going to do an hour lecture. That was a great introduction. So I gave this lecture. It was a pretty good lecture, in fact. And there was this one person who looked to be about 18. And she was sitting in the back of the room wearing a College of Community Services T-shirt and had her feet over the chair in front of her, sprawled all over the back of the room. And she asked me a couple of questions that were a little off the wall. And I was wondering, It's an interesting question. Do you step on? Do you refuse to answer it? Do you know, how do you handle it? And I gave it the best answer I humanly could. And I was saying the other one was I happened to be dressed halfway decently. Turned out it was Candace McCoy, who was the chair of the search committee.
Nice.
She looked about 18 in those days. That, so I don't know what that tells you.
Well, it tells me that you do the right thing and it pays off.
You never know what the right thing is, though.
Well, looking back on your career, you know, even all the way back to the beginning, are there things that if you could go back, you'd do differently?
I don't tend to think that way. And I mean, there are little things. There are always times that don't make that crack in the meeting, and don't hire that person you made. That was a disaster. Sure, there's a lot of that. I was 2 terms as department chair. I can think of a number of things I did wrong, which is another problem in America, education, which is department chairs don't get training. They just throw you in there and just assume that you can figure out what you're doing when someone hands you cases in sexual harassment or anything else. But what would I do? I don't have an easy answer to that one. The things I would do over. I think I had a pretty good life. I'm ready to go. I'm an old man.
Don't rush it that far.
Now I'm not going to rush it. I'm going to stick around for a while.
Well, Marty, if we think maybe a little outside of yourself and just in general, what are your thoughts on the field today?
It's scary.
What's scary?
Betsy DeVos. It's the entire field is scary, and the corporatization of American higher education, the fact that there are fewer jobs available every year, that the whole field is being taught by adjuncts more and more. And speaking as being one, it's a fascinating experience. In my subfield, what the Trump administration is attempting to do, having rescinded the 2011 Dear Colleague letter, which has set up all of the Title IX material that changed colleges all over the country to begin treating survivors of sexual assault like human beings, at least start making moves in that direction, has been rescinded. And there is a major attempt that will just, I think, I'm one of the people who thinks will just about close down the entire field, which is they want to introduce a mandatory provision, first, that all departments, all Title IX offices stop doing what's called the investigatory model, where one person goes out and does a major investigation. And you must have a hearing model, act like you're a little criminal justice system. And in that model, you must allow a representative of the man, almost always a man, the offender, the accused offender, must be allowed to cross-examine the victim survivor. And I think that'll pretty much shut down anyone making complaints to universities in the future. So no, I'm not feeling that good about it. A lot of small schools, a lot of our really good, nice 4-year liberal arts schools are caught in an economic model and are going slowly out of business, one after another. And that's not very good. So I don't understand that. I wish I knew more about the finances of that, on how predatory for-profit schools can stay in business and liberal arts schools can't, but it seems to be happening.
Yeah. What kind of advice, well, I know you are giving, I should say would you give, but I know you are giving to newly minted PhDs and students who are thinking about pursuing academia?
Well, I've certainly advised a lot of them into academia. And I think it's still a great field if you can get in. And one of the, of course, advantages of criminology, we have a tremendous advantage over many other people in that there are still jobs in criminology. And that's makes it an excellent, in criminal justice generally, and that makes it an excellent field. Although it's harder and harder every year. But the it's also a different lifestyle and a different type of job in that it sucks up a lot of your time and a lot of your energy. And it's a very different kind of a job. And if you're not ready for that, probably shouldn't go into it. And that it's when I was at NIJ, National Institute of Justice, there was a Henry Brownstein, one of the great people in this field, was in a discussion with a major supervisor there. And the supervisor was sort of needling him something about how he wrote all these books and how he got it done, and was he cheating on his job or something? And Henry just got really upset and said, I work nights and weekends to write these things. You work 9 to 5. 5:02, you go home every day. You can do whatever you want. I choose to write books. But he said, I'm using all my nights and weekends to do this. And that's really true. A lot of all of us in academics is that what I love about it, and it's fabulous, I'm not the slightest complaint, is I get to make up a lot of my own schedule. I can make a doctor's appointment when I want to go to the doctor. I don't have to get an hour's leave time. And that's just fabulous. And I can figure out a way to get to the conference anytime I want to go, up to within reason. There's lots of things that I can do. I can go home and watch in opening day today, I could go to the ball game. I could have gone right down here today and gone to a ball game instead of going to work. There's a tremendous advantage of being in this field. On the other hand, you pay for it later. When you're grading 85 term papers at 3:00 in the morning Sunday, you've just figured out a way to pay for that time.
Sure.
You're just rearranging your life for it. And I'm convinced you work a lot more hours in this job than you do in most jobs. That being said, of course, there are jobs where there are ways of getting yourself in this occupation so you stop working and still get paid, which is another great advantage if that's the kind of person you are.
Well, Marty, are there things that we've left out that we should talk about?
Yeah, I had a couple of things that I did. And all these wonderful stories for you about being in the right place at the right time. I do want to mention mentoring. That was one. Who are my mentors? That I wanted to broaden that picture and say, I've been blessed by being friends or acquaintances with an enormous number of people who are very, very brilliant and taught me an enormous amount, which includes things like, learning about feminist theory from friends of mine like Claire Renzetti and Mita Chesney-Lynn. And I've learned an enormous amount from my own students, like Jody Miller, who is brilliant and got to the point where she was correcting my work and did a fabulous job. So I've had a lot of good luck with that kind of thing too. So and certainly in criminology, particularly in critical criminology, people like David Friedrichs have been enormously influential to me at the University of Scranton. Greg Barrick, certainly I mentioned Walter DeKeseredy. There's a lot of these people who are either my age or possibly younger in some cases, who have been wildly influential to me in terms of the field, in terms of knowledge base, in terms of learning, in terms of politics. there's a lot of mentoring. We talk about mentors always as older people helping younger people, which is a form of mentoring, and it is important. And I'm not knocking it in any way, but we forget that we're influenced very heavily also by our peers. That's supposed to be why we come to conferences. That's been lost in prehistory, but originally you're supposed to come here and present your work and get feedback and learn from your peers here. But and that's been a major part of my life. As I said, I don't have a single relationship where I could say I am, like my wife even was a Zane Miller student, which has a meaning in history. In urban history, people know who Zane Miller is, and to be one of his students was a big deal. In my case, there's nothing like that. Chair of my dissertation committee reached a point when the American Society of Criminology met in Cincinnati. He asked me to go up with him and introduce him to a few of the big name people like Bill Chambliss and Richard Quinney and a couple of those kind of people he always wanted to meet. There's an interesting move for your mentor. So that's about it on that subject.
Well, and really, Marty, there's a flip side to that, and that there's a group of us who consider ourselves Marty's kids. And we even joke about being academic siblings to each other because your teaching and your mentoring was so influential to us. So I thought, maybe you don't have a few more stories in you, but I really...
Oh, I have more stories.
I really wouldn't mind if you talked a little bit about...
You?
What you thought was about me. I mean, because this is, if it can't be about you, it should be about me. But I was hoping you would talk a little bit about your teaching and what you try to accomplish with your time in the classroom and with students that really stands out.
Oh, my teaching, I'm a dancing bear in the room. I mean, my whole entire career I've taught large classes. And my real job is... I always remember, you were talking about these large classes I taught. I taught the 400 student class. I never forgot that. Kid came down one day and he's standing in front of me. And I said, yeah, did you want something? He goes, no. I sit in the back. I just wanted to see what you look like. we sort of forget that when you teach those kind of classes, you are not close up and personal with a lot of people. You're teaching to the group in the front who are sitting there probably wearing a giant orange sweatshirt, like someone I know. That was her. I don't know. I don't think my teaching is that wildly different in that sense of I try and put together a lot of, because I'm a dancing bear, because I teach this enormous classes all the time. The smallest class in my life, I think, was 37 ever, except for graduate school. I try to put together lectures that are filled with a lot of material and cover a lot of material, and then build in illustrative stories. And I try and, as I mentioned before, build in where it affected my research quite a bit. I should, if you're asking, then this is one of the key points of my teaching is I think research and teaching are very closely tied. I think that one of the biggest thing that has kept me alive in the field has been doing the literature reviews on all of these articles and books. I really learned a lot. And I wouldn't know that stuff if I hadn't done the research. And I managed to bring a lot of that into the classroom. There's a lot of knowledge base there that feeds into teaching. And I think that research is extremely important in making me a better teacher. It's not that every good teacher has to have done research. There's a lot of great teachers out there. But I think for the normal run-of-the-mill person, a mix of teaching and research is the proper way to run your life. So that's my advice. Go do some research.
Martin, talking about your work on male peer support theory, can you give us a little idea about what it is, what it means to the field, and what those findings are bringing us today?
Well, what we found generally, as I said, it started out in Walter's doctoral dissertation. And what he did was began it very quickly by doing a fairly simple question, is saying that dating is a very stressful thing for a lot of men. And when they enter into a period of stress, what they tend to do is they tend to ask for advice of their friends. And friends give them a lot of advice. Unfortunately, some friends give them advice that the rest of us don't like. You have a right to slap her around if she won't pay attention to you. Or if you pay for dinner, she owes you sex, or anything along that line. And he felt that it was related to sexual assault. And what we did was begin to flesh that out into a full theory. What are the kinds of things? And we developed a whole lengthy, complex theory of said that it took place only in a system, a patriarchal system, and particularly a traditional system of familial patriarchy, in the family where people who are taught from a very early age that men are in charge, men run the dates, that when a man pays for a date, they deserve to have sex afterwards, and a wide number of other issues like that. It also tended to be not run through all of society. It is not something that everybody did. It was something that people did in certain places, and it involved objectification of women. It involved a situation where women, how do you do this? It was our whole question. How can you take a person that's your friend, maybe your girlfriend, and commit acts of violent felony crime against them, and then seem to think somehow it's okay? And one of the ways you do that is you objectify them. Something, for example, we know a lot of the literature in the war from that how do you get people to kill? It's very hard. And most of the time, with most people, it's very difficult to get them to fire their guns in warfare. And how do you do that? What you do is you objectify the enemy. We never fought fine people from a deep and complex Asian culture. We fought slinty-eyed gooks. The same thing with the Germans. We had to reduce them to subhuman. Then it was okay to kill them. You have to be able to do that with women also. You have to be able to be in a position where you can objectify women and do that. You have to be in a position, and this is what a lot of groups do, of valorizing and making important certain kinds of men. It's not only just men, but it's men who are athletic, men who have money, men who fit certain images that are tops. Also men who are sexually successful. Actually, we knew a lot about that from work of a lot of people, Daniel Glazer, a lot of people on gang behavior, on how men spend an enormous amount of time bragging about their sexual prowess, which they may or may not have. We found there was a whole group of these types of things. We brought in the fact that it was a drinking environment had a lot to do with it. We found environments where women were in a lot of trouble, included a wide series of building up of all of these events. The objectification of women, the fact also that there was no deterrence in that with all the noise that's all over the world about, particularly from men's rights groups and the Department of Education, about how men keep getting in trouble, Go to any campus in America, anywhere, and find out how many men have been convicted of violence against women in the last year in a student tribunal. Two, one, there isn't a large group of men getting in trouble. Generally, when you look at and compare the numbers, how many women in this campus have been the victims of sexual assault, and it tends to be thousands on every campus, and how many men have been convicted of this? Two. What you'll find is there's no deterrence. Men can do whatever they want and get away with it. The system is set up that way. When you add all that together, we found, you end up with a situation where, and of course, Walter's big contribution was to add to that, that men provide information how to do it, and they provide legitimation by supporting it. And some of my work added to it the fact that the modeling of this behavior, that in a lot of cases, people had abusive peers. And that was, a lot of work that I had done. So we began adding it all together into a model, and what we found over and over again on all types of different campuses, on different groups, on groups that were groups of juveniles in prison, on groups of different kinds of camp. We did it on Gaelic-speaking campuses. We did it on English-speaking, French-speaking campuses in Canada. Anywhere we went, we had found that being the subject of male peer support, that being supported this way, having friends who offered support to you for this concept, who told you that it's okay to do this to women, in an environment where there's heavy drinking, and being a member of a group that did this, was heavily supported it was predictive of admitted by the men sexual assault. We found of all this, having this whole thing together, having all of this at one point, the heavy drinking combined with the friends, combined with the information, made men almost 10 times as likely to admit to having committed sexual assault on a friend of theirs as men who didn't have these three. So it's been cited by a lot of people in a lot of different ways. It's actually weathered very nicely in the field. Some people have added to it. Courtney Franklin did some work where she pointed out something that we had mentioned and then really didn't highlight high enough, that it isn't all men, that there seemed to be a subgroup of men who are more likely to become sexual assaulters. She studied it by doing a test of this theory and adding in low self-control. I'm not the world's biggest fan of low self-control theory, so I probably wouldn't have added that in, but I think she's right. That's something. That there's some question that there are some men who are psychologically predisposed in an area to not take easy messages, to not care that it's your friends that you're assaulting. I think the word is sociopath, but some variant of that is important, moving in that direction to add to our theory. But it's weathered very nicely. We're still finding it today. We presented a paper at ACJS this year making the argument that that within the LGBTQ community, that we were studying here this new thing we've been looking at is polyvictimization, and we found that students who have abusive peers, who their friends are abusive, are much more likely to be abused themselves, and within the LGBTQ community. So And we were looking at it as multiply abused, not just abused. The other thing, by the way, we've been looking at lately is been the concept of polyvictimization. Done 2 or 3 articles on it in the last few months. And it's a psychological term, and it's been very heavily used in psychology. Almost 100% of their work, though, and there's hundreds of articles on it, has been looking at early childhood victimization and how it affects current adolescent or late child psychological development. So in other words, what they're looking at, the original idea, and the people who are arguing it, Sherry Hamby and David Wolf and some of these people are arguing, is that its real best use has been to point out to clinicians that there's a reason why. They've always been confused, criminologists also. Why is it that women act so weird that when you, they've had age, yeah, they were victimized, but I mean, they overreact to it. They're just totally devastated by this thing, their inappropriately strong reaction to a victimization. And that they're pointing out is because it probably isn't their first victimization.
Right.
And it probably is their 8th victimization. And then the polyvictimization is that it's across a number of different areas. A lot of these kids are child physical abuse victims, child sexual abuse victims. They're neglected. They're bullied in school. And all that combines together so that when they're 13 years old and somebody comes up and grabs their butt or something, and they fall apart and react badly, it's because it's the 93rd thing that's happened to them. That's what it's been used for. We were using it in adult on adult thing, which is very rare, almost never used that way, to look at the extent to which the women who are being stalked, women who are being sexually harassed on campus, are victims of multiple cases of this and across different categories. And that's what we're working right now, is looking at this polyvictimization concept. And we're finding, of course, that there's an enormous amount of polyvictimization on campus. And that, as I said, having abusive friends, what we're calling now negative peer support, is very highly related to it. One of the most interesting areas we've been moving into, and it's the advantage of having the campus climate survey to deal with, is that this is 6,000 students on a 30,000 student campus, a pretty high response rate, a lot of data. And what we're generally found in that situation was that the male peer support concept we're using still predicts not only victimization, but polyvictimization, but also that the rates of stalking and sexual harassment on college campuses is tremendously higher than people generally talked about or thought. And that we think this is a very important part of the victimization experiences that many women go through. There was a period we were very impressed by. In the 60s, there was enormous literature for many, many years about why do women overreact. That it's so confusing to criminologists. Well, I mean, a dozen of them writing on the subject of we don't understand. Women are afraid to walk the streets, and here they've never been raped and they're still afraid to walk the streets. And who can figure out why these crazy women are out there overreacting like this? And what we're finding is two things. The first, that it's because they've been polyvictimized, and this is just the latest one. And the second one, that we've been bringing back a lot of Liz Kelly's work on continuum of sexual violence, is that the amount of male boorish behavior probably has not gone down. You'd think that in today's world it might slowly be reducing. But if you talk to a lot of these women, the survey that we did, the number of women who are the victim of catcalls, being followed home in a car when they're trying to walk home, any of these kinds of things is still extraordinarily high. I don't know if it's higher, we don't have base rates. So I don't know if it's going up or down. But it's very high today. Does that answer enough for you?
I mean, I could listen all day long, Marty.
Isn't that true?
So it's important work, and I thank you for that contribution. And really, we appreciate you coming by today and being part of the oral history of criminology. And we're really lucky to have such an outstanding scholar, mentor, and teacher among us.
Thank you. I chose my interviewer well.